Throughout the medium of video games, there are very few franchises that are granted the ability to tell a continuous story for as long as the Trails franchise has. Trails of Cold Steel 4 serves as the ending of the first saga in the series and is the culmination of a 9-game-long story spanning 14 years of development. The question to be asked here is, did the game succeed as a conclusion to the franchise's first saga? Let's find out in this review and thematic analysis of Trails of Cold Steel 4. Trails of Cold Steel 4 starts 2 weeks after the ending of Trails of Cold Steel 3, and in the opening sequence, we learn that Erebonia is preparing for an all-out war against Calvard by conducting a national draft. I really like how during this first sequence, we get to see the entire country's reaction to this global event that we triggered. I really like this because, like I said in my Cold Steel 2 video, I didn't like how that game was kind of closed off and showing how the country reacts to stuff that they should be reacting to. And I also really like this because it reminded me of One Piece and how we transitioned from like this major huge battle to going into like political exposition, the same way that One Piece went from Whole Cake Island to the Reverie arc into Wano. Some of the biggest reveals here are that the Thor's main branch students and faculty have been sent to the branch campus and Shirley joined Thor's as a student. We also learned during this sequence that the black fog that was released across Erebonia at the end of Cold Steel 3 made everyone forget the heroes of this region, specifically Reen and the SSS. And finally, we get to see Shira again, which made me really happy because I love Shira, and it would have been 11 years since we saw her in the series since Trails the Third, which is a very long time for a character not to be in a series. After the intro of the game, the scene transitions into Joshua, Ren, Estelle, our boy Lloyd, Kia, and Redacted going up the 20th floor of Orcus Tower together. And if you came from my Cold Steel 3 video, you know how much I was anticipating seeing, just Estelle alone, but seeing all these characters come together and interact so early on just made me smile. I was really happy to see this scene. So I think now is a great time, especially with this scene, to bring up something that's going to keep recurring throughout Cold Steel 4 as a consequence of this game being a convergence point. So all of these character interactions between each of the arcs, like the Liberal arc, the Crossbell arc, and Erebonia, are converging into this one game, and they were all saved for this one game. So that's cool, and I was eating it up the whole time, but as a consequence of that, the writers needed to cram these interactions wherever they could. So if there's a scene that has Lloyd Bannings and Estelle together, they're gonna have to interact because we've been waiting on this since the beginning of the series, and they're gonna have to stop the entire flow of the scene to give them this one minor interaction to build this development that we've been waiting on, which is cool. But when every character in the game has to have an interaction with somebody else, they're gonna have to keep stopping these scenes in the flow of the main story to give them these interactions. Me personally, I love that they made time for all these interactions, but I do think that it's fair criticism to say that it breaks the flow of the scenes and that a lot of it could be trimmed down a little bit. Also, with this scene in particular, there's a lot of character background dunks and geopolitical jargon since these characters are from different countries and need to catch each other and also the player up on these details. This is all heavily front-loaded to serve as a refresher for people who played the previous games and people who have only played the Cold Steel games at the same time and don't know who these characters are. And I could see this being off-putting for both parties because it was for me, and I'm pretty well versed on all of this. The flow of this entire section of the game is basically, hey, here's the tutorial. Let's go 5 minutes and fight these monsters in the geofront. When we get to this checkpoint, now it's time for the characters to interact with each other. By the way, did you know Ren's an enforcer? By the way, did you know that we're bracers? By the way, did you know we're part of the SSS? By the way, did you know that we've been at war for like 30 years and stuff like that, so on and so forth. And this is nothing new for Cold Steel, but it's even worse in this game because they have so many more characters and interactions and interconnectedness that they have to figure out. And it's like the whole game really just from this point on is, hey, go to this point, talk, this point, talk, this point, talk, boss fight, talk, this point, act 2. I found myself bringing this issue up throughout the script, so I'm just going to call this the Cold Steel Conundrum, and just know that when I reference the Cold Steel Conundrum, that this is the issue I'm talking about, where like we go to one point in the map, exposition, and then keep repeating that over and over again until we go to the next big story beat, just for character interactions. Back to the plot of the game though, I love that Kia follows you and the party throughout this section, and that you get to talk to her as you progress. I thought this was a really cute touch, and I loved her dialogue. At the end of the dungeon, we end up fighting Mariabelle, Black Alberic, and Claire checks her message and finds a picture of her, Reen, and Milliam together. Not only was this scene touching, it revealed an important detail. Even though Claire is on the bad side, she still misses and more importantly remembers Reen and Milliam. It's after this scene that the game officially starts and leads into a scene with New Class 7, which, as y'all know, I love New Class 7, like a lot. Some of my favorite characters in the entire series. Yuna wakes up from a dream in her homeroom class to find herself wearing a main campus uniform, which was sort of hinted at earlier with the branches merging, and we find that all the students are together. As soon as I saw Ash in the scene, I had built up a narrative in my head that they had all had their memories wiped as well, and that they were all going to school under the Empire to continue being used as pawns of war. When we get to the dorms, we find that Reen and everyone present in the final battle of CS3 were also removed from their memory. Once they go into Reen's room and find pictures of him, his coat, and his sword, they all wake up and discover that they were all having the same dream and that they're together in the hidden village of Iran. I thought that the sequence was very well executed, and it had me constantly second guessing myself the whole time, even though I knew that this couldn't possibly be a reality. They wake up to find Roselia, Randy, and all of Old Class 7 with them, and we learn that Emma transported all of them here at the end of the Battle of Cold Steel 3. And we also find out that Reen and Valimar had been taken captive by the gnomes. I also love that as soon as Altina woke up, she started crying, which was a pretty big character development for her right off the bat. I was most looking forward to her development out of most of New Class 7, especially at the end of Cold Steel 3, so I was really happy to see this. This is also where I found out that the Steam version of the game gives you all the DLC from CS3, so I messed with that for like 20 minutes, and a lot of these costumes were very weird and very self-aware of some of the character tropes, but you know I had to put the cat ears on everybody. If you watch my Cold Steel 2 video, you know I just had cat ears on everybody for no reason, and I kind of did the same thing in this game. When we get Control and Eren, we go and talk to all the old Class 7 members, and they're just all depressed after the end of Cold Steel 3. I thought the standout character reintroduction here was Eustace, since he had the closest relationship with Millium. Once New Class 7 realizes that Old Class 7 had been hiding Reen's true lineage from them, Yuna gets infuriated and starts to ring them all up and just absolutely flame all of them. As soon as I saw her getting upset, I said I know she's about to pop off, and as always, she absolutely did. She tells them that they need to stop feeling so sorry for themselves and go save Reen because he's done it for them countless times, and I love this because it pushes New Class 7's relationship to the forefront of this game and lets Old Class 7 stay in the background while also elevating Yuna's character even higher. To end the chapter, we see a scene with Muse, the now Supreme Commander of the Viceland Army, with Vita, Aurelia, and Bardia, explaining how they failed to stop the Great Twilight. We also see Ash escaping prison, as well as Crow, who's regained his consciousness and identity, standing in front of the restrained Valimar in red Arcuate Reen as the prologue ends. Chapter 1 begins with Old Class 7 splitting off to do their own thing, while New Class 7 explores the new old schoolhouse. And I was really fatigued by this recurring type of dungeon in Cold Steel games, and really most of Cold Steel dungeons as a whole, but most of them are short enough that I can deal with them. By the end of it, we see Roselia transformed into her true form, and it's revealed that she gave a portion of her power to create Selene and Granios. I did not mean to say Granios, it's like Granos or something. After the mandatory hot spring scene of the game, we leave for St. Arc. A detail that I really liked when we reached the base in St. Arc is how Randy's taken aback by how he viewed New Class 7 as his old SSS members once they started working. Yuna's Lloyd, Altina's Tio, and Kurt is Ellie, I guess? But I really like that he's reflecting on his early experiences with New Class 7's early experiences of being on their own. Another detail that I absolutely loved is that every single NPC talks in detail about the war and specifically how other countries are impacting their personal lives. This type of world building is what Trails excels at, and I live for this, and I love that they're tapping into this a lot more compared to Cold Steel 1 and 2. Not only are they talking about the war and how it impacts them, they're also talking about how the Black Fog is affecting them and their families and their relationships, and the party's also subtly picking up on people that are being affected by it, which is just like, this is all I could ask for in a Trails game, man. This level of attention to detail in the world building is what I live for. While we're in St. Arc, we meet Kyrie, who basically just joins us and helps, and there's not much to say here. This is just the standard Cold Steel formula where we go from one place, we find an old class member, we go to the next one, we fight somebody else, talk to NPCs, stuff like that. On top of this, the side content from CS2 is back with the Shrine Dungeons and the S-Link chests, which at this point was a pretty big indicator that Cold Steel 4 is just kind of going to be Cold Steel 2 Part 2, which was cool from like a gameplay standpoint, but from a narrative and like a pacing standpoint, I was kind of worried because y'all know how people feel about Cold Steel 2. When we reach Titus Gate, we find Anton, of all people, who was completely absent from Cold Steel 3 for the first time in the series since he was stuck in Liberal. So I was really happy to see him and excited to see where his storyline went, because I'm assuming that his storyline ends in this game. I don't know if he shows up in Reverie or in Kuro or Kuro 2. But we'll see. Our trails eventually lead to Hamel, and we find Ash sitting in a house followed by what I consider to be one of the best scenes in the entire Cold Steel arc. This scene showcases each of the new Class 7 members' growth and really allows their personalities and approaches to dealing with conflict to shine, and I just absolutely loved this entire scene. Ash feels worthless and helpless for being used as a pawn and wants to give up entirely on everything, and new Class 7 snaps him out of it by saying that Reen had it a lot worse and that he's the one that actually triggered the Great Twilight. They tell him that the past can't be undone and that Ash should be grateful that he's survived to live his current life. From a narrative standpoint, I love this because this scene in New Class 7's message reflects Reen's personal outlook on life after the events of Cold Steel 1 and 2, that everything that's happened in the past was for a reason and that he, and by extension Ash, are worthy of having a place to belong despite everything that's happened to them. These thematic parallels between Ash and Reen, with Reen being the one to teach Ash the lesson that he learned in CS 1 and 2, is what I love about Cold Steel, and I wish that they ran with it more between Old Class 7 and New Class 7, because I feel like my biggest issue with Cold Steel is that they could have had more of these interactions between Old Class 7 and New Class 7 and the theme of like teaching the new generation from your own past experiences. But I think that the writers were scared that people were going to get upset that they stopped writing Old Class 7, so they decided to reintegrate them back into this game instead of just letting New Class 7 be the protagonist. It's kind of like the issue with Dragon Ball in that Gohan was supposed to be the protagonist, but people were holding on to Goku and they couldn't let Gohan be the protagonist. So now Goku's Super Saiyan God 37. It's not as bad as Dragon Ball, but just imagine if New Class 7 actually got as much development and they kept continuing this theme of teaching the new generation with the stuff that you learned in Cold Steel 1 and 2. Like, how cool would that be? This incredible scene was totally whiplash by them revealing that Gilbert is just the captain of the 6th regime, just like he said he would be in Trails the 3rd, and I thought that this was a perfect revelation, and it was hilarious to see that he was still as incompetent as ever through his gameplay. I love Gilbert. Zephyr comes through to intervene and fights the party here too, followed by Fee, Sarah, and Elliot, my boy, jumping in to save us. And as y'all know, I love Elliot, but I feel like the writers just kind of stuck him in this scene just to show that he's like, you know, here. They just stuck him in. After we fight Zephyr, they leave, we return back to Aaron, and the chapter ends. The following day marks the start of Act 1 Part 2, and nothing really crazy happens during this act that didn't already happen in the first part, so I'll just name some standout moments in this section. We meet Ellie's mom, Dorothy, and return to Raquel with Ash. The Raquel section was interesting to go through because we get to see what everyone's perception of Ash is after the events of Cold Steel 3. Most of the people that grew up with Ash wholeheartedly believe that he didn't do it, while most of the civilians blame him for the state of the world and the upcoming war. I also really like that Hugo from Old Class 7 threatened the party when they made it here. I really like the idea of some of the people that graduated from Thor's being on the quote-unquote bad side, so this was really welcome to me. On the way to Alster, we meet with two traveling women who are presumably from Rempharia. One of them is hostile towards the party while the other one is friendly, and I didn't know what to think of these two characters at the time, but I really like their party dynamic. Later, it's revealed that the blonde-haired girl was Lucy Sayland, who was a member of the Genis Royal Academy along with Chloe and Lecter in the Trails in the Sky games, and I honestly completely forgot about her, so this was a really nice surprise. After Alster, we reached the Osgiliath basement, and this name was a red flag to me because Osgiliath? Gileath Osborne? It was too on the nose for me. Like, that's suspicious. Once we reach the basin, we're met with Aurelia and Muse, or Mildine Juzalith de Cayenne. She does the Trails villain special where she lays out her master plan for 10 minutes, followed by another Trail special of Yuna popping off as usual with another speech. And I think that now is a good time than any to talk about Yuna's role in the first act of this game. Since Rena is out of commission for obvious reasons, someone had to take up the role of protagonist. I'm not sure what the majority of people who've played the game think, but in my opinion, the decision to make Yuna the protagonist, or at least a quasi-protagonist, in the first act of the game makes perfect sense. I'd go so far as to argue that she's even one of the better Trails protagonists, because she's literally the culmination of every single one of them. She has the spirit of Estelle. She's literally Lloyd Bannings Jr. She's taught by Lloyd. She understands the nuance between Erebonia and Crossbell and wants to unify both of them, so she represents both Erebonia and Crossbell, and she also carries on the will of Reen in Old Class 7. In every scene that she's in, Yuna is convincing and empathetic while also staying true to her character. Like, she'll call you stupid while telling you that everyone needs you in the same sentence. And this is what I really like about her and other protagonists such as Estelle and Kevin when compared to Reen and my boy Lloyd. I also think that the character writing has been a lot better when Yuna's been the party lead when compared to Reen in the past 3 games. I think a big part of this is due to everyone's relationships and development not revolving around Yuna being present in the scene like they are when Rin is present in the scene. Because when Rin is in a scene, everything revolves more around him, but when Yuna is in the scene, it's more focused on the characters that are in the scene rather than Yuna herself. I'm really interested to see how you guys feel about new Class 7 being the focus compared to old Class 7, so let me know in the comments below. I really am interested in that because I don't really keep up with what the community says about these characters. Muse tells the party her master plan to fight Calvard, even if it means sacrificing Class 7 and all of Erebonia, only for Yuna to call her out on her bluff. And shortly after, we're jumped by Cedric, his class, Major Michael, Shirley, and the Red Constellation, and Muse rejoins the party. Once we whoop Cedric, he pulls out the Testarossa and but ends up losing anyway. It doesn't even use the weapons as far as I know. I need Cedric to catch a break on the right team one day. This dude's been a walking series of L's and inferiority complexes since he was introduced. Like, I need my boy to win. After that second weapon, Michael makes a retreat and we get to see a mini reunion between Roselia, Emma, and Vita as we reclaim the next singularity. We regroup at Aaron again to see a short scene of Rin slowly regaining his conscience, and we end off the chapter. At the start of Act 1, Part 3, Josette picks up the party from Aaron Village and takes us to Crossbow. On the way, we see a standoff in the sky between Calvard and Erebonia, which forces them to take a detour. And again, I like how we get to see how war is affecting everyone, but specifically people from Crossbow. There's an event in Crossbow where we get to see a Calvardian immigrant get deported at his job, and this is something that would happen in a war that we didn't get to see covered in Cold Steel 2, so I'm really happy to see this topic covered in Cold Steel 4. When we returned to Crossbow, it was really interesting to see all these areas that weren't accessible in Cold Steel 3 and all the NPC storylines that have been developing through the curse. There's too many to name here, but I think the most important is definitely Harold being drafted into the front lines. And in case you forgot, Harold is Ren's father. We eventually end up in Geofront X, which has some crazy background music by the way, where we get jumped by Hugh, who's apparently allied with Ouroboros now, only to get saved by Estelle and Redacted. They hold down the fort while we escape, and we find Campanella and Lecter standing on a rooftop watching over us, talking about the plan, whichever phase they're on now. We also unlock Pom Pom Party here, which returns from the Crossbow games, and I really enjoyed this minigame along with Vantage Masters, and I look forward to playing every single NPC that challenged me, even if it meant fighting Tio again, which gave me nightmares in Azure. We eventually reached St. Ursula to speak with Emperor Eugen. Something that I really appreciate about this part of the game is that they remixed the original track that played in St. Ursula and the Crossbow games for this game. Throughout the entirety of Cold Steel 3 and 4, none of the themes that were used in Crossbow were reused for these games, so it was nice to see this here. Also, shouting myself out, if you enjoy music analysis, I got videos analyzing the music from Trails in the Sky and Trails from Crossbow, so if you're interested in that, hit that up after this video. In this scene, Emperor Eugen forgives Ash since he believes he's just a victim of the curse, and he also gives us some lore, but I honestly couldn't comprehend anything he was saying. Whenever people talk about the lore, events, and plans leading up to the events in this game, I completely lose track of what anyone's talking about. And I've always felt like everyone talks around what's actually happening instead of just being direct anytime anything plot related is revealed, and by this point, I gave up trying to fully comprehend any of it. Even in retrospect, looking at it back now, it still makes very little sense to me, and I understand what happens in the game. We leave St. Ursula and head straight to Disneyland. Here we get to see Alan propose to Bridget, except he's under the influence of the curse, which is not good. We also get to meet Yuna's dad for the first time, which was really nice, and fun fact, Yuna's the only Trails protagonist with both her parents alive. We also get to see a development in the storyline with Harold and his family, as Colin comes to terms with his father being drafted in the end. Once we go and investigate the singularity outside of Disneyland, we end up fighting Lecter, Campanella, and Sharon, only to be jumped by Rufus and his Divine Knight. At the end of this fight, we're saved by the Liberal Gang, Lloyd, Kia, and Redacted, as well as Phantom Thief B, surprisingly, who was revealed to be acting under the guise of Eliester. Despite all these characters being here and having existing relationships with specifically Lecter and Phantom Thief B, nothing happens in this scene. Eustace basically talks to Rufus and he's like, "What are you doing?" And Rufus is like, "Oh, I have plans, big plans," and then he leaves. And then Lecter's like, "I have plans, big plans," and then he leaves, despite him interacting with literally every single arc's worth of characters and all these parties. So this scene doesn't really add anything to the story, they're just all here and the characters just leave. The only real plot progression that happens is that they find the singularity and Ash gets to meet Joshua. That's about it. All these other characters did not need to be here for this scene, aside from the spectacle of it. Critique aside, it was cool to see most of the main party together, minus some of the SSS and Reen. When the scene ends, all the party split off, and Kia and Ren joined the party, ending the chapter. Once the Fragment chapter begins, the party gets sent back to the Black Workshop, and here it's revealed that Angelica is being controlled by the enemy the same way that Crow was when he was the Azure Secret. McBurn decides to show up to stop Class 7, and we also see that Dooley and Crow are wavering in their loyalty as they both plot to save Reen. Reen slowly regains consciousness right before he escapes the shackles of his red Arcuate form, and once Celine sees this, she has no choice but to use a spell to save him, but more importantly, she turns into her human form here. And I'm not gonna lie, I had a gut feeling that she would turn into a cat girl by the end of the series as soon as she was introduced in CS1, so I've been looking forward to this, but I was still surprised to see how much they nailed her character design. This is definitely one of my favorite character designs in the series, but I'm also just a sucker for cat girls in general, so I'm probably not the best person to gauge whether or not this is actually a good character design or not. As we progress through the dungeon, Reen and Celine are intercepted by Crow and Duvali. Here, Crow gives Reen back the 50 mirror coin he stole at the beginning of Cold Steel 1, and the two of them join the party. I've always loved the concept of Crow building interest throughout the series from a narrative standpoint, so the literal and figurative payoff of this scene really hit for me. And from a gameplay standpoint, Crow is one of, if not the most overloaded character in the entire franchise, and he complements Reen nicely in more ways than one. I never took him out of my party from this point on. In the next series of fights, Duvali confronts Ines and Inea and how she feels about blindly following Arianrod's plans for the Great Twilight, and Class 7 fights against Angelica and George. This all leads up to new Class 7 having to fight against their Berserk instructor, which I love from a narrative standpoint. This fight causes Reen to regain himself for a bit, which allows everyone allied with him to channel their energy back into a spirit bond. Use the power of friendship and the Septium veins to get through to him. And as tropey and by the books as this was, I really enjoyed this scene. Reen's entire character arc is about him trying to save and uplift others while disregarding himself, so everyone giving their all to support him in this way just makes sense. Milliam being the last person to forgive and encourage him was also a great touch for both Reen and Altina to move forward after this scene. Reen and Altina's character arcs have always been written to complement each other, and this scene served as a major development for both characters. From a writing standpoint, these types of power or friendship scenes typically only serve to develop one character, but here we get to see how much Reen's mentorship and suffering has caused everyone, but specifically Altina, to grow to protect him in return. That's a major part of why I like Altina's character in relation to Reen's development throughout the Cold Steel games. Once Reen returns to his true self, Ouroboros, Arianrod, Black Alberic, and Osborne himself all reveal themselves to the party. This is the first time that Black Alberic and Elisa interact with each other too. Here's a good time to talk about the theory I held across the past few games about Elisa's father. It was wrong. Like, completely wrong. I thought that Gideon was actually Elisa's father in CS1, and I mixed up Black Alberic, who is Elisa's actual father, with Gideon, who's actually just dead. If I were to make an analogy about it, I was using two separate puzzles with different pieces that still somehow fit together and made something that was completely wrong as a finished end product that could work in theory. I think my theory was still cool even though it was completely wrong, but hey, we can't win them all. This scene is also where Duvali asks for permission to defect from the Star Ritter, to which Arianrod accepts with no hesitation and even wishes her well. I love how we have characters that are wavering from their positions in this game, especially through a character as devoted to her leader and cause as Duvali. After the dialogue, we're tasked with fighting against Arianrod and Osborne himself, and I don't think I've explicitly said it before in any of my videos, so I'll say it now. The developers and writers have done a great job of making Arianrod feel like an imposing boss to go up against, especially if you play Trails to Azure. The encounter against her in Azure is one of the most difficult and intense fights I've ever experienced in a jrpg, and in that game it was a struggle to even just survive the fight. In Trails to Azure, in order to win, get all the bonus AP and extra dialogue, you don't need to kill her, you just need to break her mask. Going from that uphill battle of fighting to survive or break her mask to actually having to completely beat her and 3 other knights at the same time in Cold Steel 3 is intimidating. Building up Arianrod between 3 games and placing her directly next to Osborne, who's the final boss of the game, just shows how strong Osborne is alone without having to do any extra work, while also showing how far the party has come in terms of strength. But all I know is he couldn't beat Goku, so after this battle, a portal appears out of the sky with airships carrying Aurelia, Agate, Vita, and Randy. They and Old Class 7 hold everyone off while Reen goes to recover Valimar. Once he, Osborne, Arianrod, and Crow get into Divine Knights, they decide to completely stop fighting and line up for a Soul Train line. Instead of fighting, they decide to talk, and it's revealed that the true plans that have been set in motion are called the Rivalries. Looking back on it now, it's pretty obvious what they were talking about, but it completely went over my head the first time I watched this scene, which also leads into, again, one of my biggest issues with the Cold Steel story. Everyone, villains and heroes alike, always talks either in code around what they're actually referencing, and it makes it difficult to follow what they're even referencing. Once they introduced the rivalries concept through this scene, I didn't even try to comprehend what they were saying because I was still lost in the concept of the Great Twilight, the Phantasmal Blaze Plan, and Operation Jumanji or Jumanji. Oh, I didn't know how to say that, so I said Jumanji. In my eyes, this was just another term that went in one ear and out the other, and I'd given up in trying to comprehend any of it by this point, even though they were trying to spell it out for me here. But to sum up what they're saying, the rivalries is a battle royale where the winner becomes the resurrector of the Great One, and the only way that the rivalries can happen is if the world is on the brink of destruction, which is why the Great Twilight was started. So that's phase 1, and phase 2 is now the rivalries, in order to resurrect the Great One. I don't know if it's just me, but I did not understand that for like 90% of the series, and I was just going along for the ride. I didn't understand this until the very end of the game. After the explanation, despite the fact that we have some of, if not the strongest players in all of Erebonia and just held our own against everyone opposing us in the room, we decided to all retreat from the battle. At the time I thought this was annoying, but later we find out that Cedric and the rest of the bad guys were right outside, so I guess this would have been acceptable in retrospect, but not really. Overall, Act 1 was pretty enjoyable. The main point of this act from a narrative standpoint was to see how war was impacting Erebonia, Crossbell, and its citizens, and I think it did a great job of doing so, while still advancing the plot in a believable fashion. I absolutely love seeing Yuna as the protagonist of the act, and it fits most of the issues that I found throughout Cold Steel 2, but little did I know, we were actually getting a whole lot more of Cold Steel 2 in the upcoming act, Act 2. Act 2 begins with Rean waking up in Aaron to find new Class 7 and Altina by his side, which I thought was really cute. Here, Rean gets to catch up with everyone and gets to formally meet with Ren and Kia for the first time. And we find out that Crow and Duvali decide to leave the party to go to Bryonia Island by themselves to find their destinies, as Crow put it, so the party decides to chase after them. Rean is also the protagonist throughout the rest of the game from this point on, which I'll talk about later. On the way to the island, there's a great scene between Rean, Yuna, and Altina where Yuna finally gets to thank Rean for saving her family. Rean admits that watching her protect her family stayed on his mind and saved him from doing anything reckless in order to protect Crossbell and Erebonia during the Civil War. Once we reach the shrine, we get to fight against Crow and Duvali, and the only minor nitpick that I had at the scene was that they should have used Crow's theme Blue Destination here, since this is the final standoff between Rean and Crow. After Rean wins the fight, Crow attempts to give up and sacrifice his life for Rean and the rivalries, but Rean steps in and literally gives him back his life with the help of Millium's spirit. I thought this was an interesting development in Rean's character because he tells Crow that he's going to live, fight, struggle, and survive no matter what it takes. This is exactly what everyone's been beating over Rean's head for the past 4 games, so it's nice to see him finally internalize it. After this scene, Rean wakes up alongside Class 7, Crow, and Duvali, who join our party again. It's decided that our next objective here is to find the remaining students and former students of Thor's, which... Did this happen in Cold Steel 2? This is what I was talking about when I said we'd be seeing a whole lot more of Cold Steel 2 this act. From an in-universe standpoint, it doesn't really make sense to me that we're days away from the start of a continental war and we're looking for a bunch of students and helping citizens while gathering intel. The sense of urgency throughout this act just wasn't there for me, and I felt like there was a better way for them to prepare for the war. From a narrative standpoint though, this act's primary purpose is to tie up loose ends between all the NPCs and side character stories throughout the Erebonia arc. While it drastically lowered the stakes of the story for me and made the game feel bloated, I can admit that it wasn't as bad as how CS2 handled it, since the game had the same issues but in the middle of the Civil War. I honestly don't know how this could have been executed better, since the character bloat and pacing issues have been a growing problem all throughout the arc, on top of Cold Steel 4 taking on the monumental burden of having to resolve 2 other arcs at the same time. That's not to say I didn't enjoy these resolutions though. Act 2 showcased what I love about this series through its NPCs feeling like living characters, and every time the story progressed, NPCs also updated as they always have, but this time around they had more leniency for the locations, which meant that there was a constant surprise of seeing NPCs from all 3 arcs interacting with each other. What I mean by this is that we could see Erebonia NPCs interacting with Trails in the Sky NPCs and Crossbell NPCs interacting with, Trails in the Sky NPCs, which was really cool. Before now, we haven't had a lot of crossover between the NPCs, but seeing this happen in real time was really cool. And even though I love all these interactions and I wanted to see more of them, it started becoming really overwhelming as they started to update more frequently and more NPCs were starting to cross over with each other. At a certain point, I had to slow down and start focusing on the main story, which is something I never do in these games, just because there were so many interactions that I wanted to see. And I want to make sure that y'all know that this isn't a pacing issue, this is just me wanting to see everything and be a completionist as an issue. The writers did a great job and I don't want to knock them for adding too much content because this is all optional at the end of the day. I just wanted to see all of it because I love it so much. Now where I will say that there's a pacing issue is actually in the main story. Act 2 is the largest act of the game, but looking back on it, nothing really contributes towards the main cause or main plot of the story. The gameplay loop of each day in Act 2 is essentially just this. Start in the Merkaba, talk, do bonding events and play minigames with the war students, pick up the side quests, do the side quests, talk to NPCs across Erebony while picking up the missable items, do the main quest, and then just repeat that. I think that now is also a good time to talk about bonding events in Cold Steel 4. The bonding events in this game were both solid for new and old Class 7, but I did have a major issue with how the women's events were handled. If you want to even get access to the final bonding events for the female characters, you need to see all their bonding events with the limited points, which essentially means that you have to completely skip the men's bonding events entirely. I don't really like that because I wanted to see my bros get a final bonding event, but if I had to get locked out of content just to see other content, I don't think that's good game design. This also contributes to another issue that I have with these games, where the developers actively incentivize you to sacrifice something for something else in another playthrough or for New Game Plus. And the series is long enough as is, so it's hard to justify replaying most of them to see everything. I personally just cheat or save scum in order to get everything in this game because I don't have time to replay these games anymore on top of making videos for them. Some of the bonding events for the women in Class 7 also have very abrupt moments at the end where they unnecessarily confess to Reen, which ruins an otherwise great scene. I think that the developers could have avoided this by allowing you to check a box saying whether or not you wanted a relationship to be platonic or romantic, and that would have worked out. I don't really think I want to talk too much about the actual bonding events themselves, but I'll talk about some of my favorites. Some of my favorite events were definitely Yusa's, Gaia's, and Towa's. Yusa's bonding event was by far the best one in the entire series and some of the best writing in the entire series. His events were very natural and elevated his entire character for me, and I loved how he grieved and accepted William's death through his bonding events. Gaius' bonding events were an incredible conclusion to his character arc that was really subtle up until that point. He'd always been a very grounded character, so hearing his experience with becoming a Dominion was very interesting. And y'all know I love Towa's bonding events because she's canonically best girl and is one of my favorite characters ever. Getting back to the main storyline, we infiltrate the mansion in Ordis and we're met with Claire and Red Rosvice. And we talk to Claire, who reveals that she draws her power from the Great Twilight itself, which is how she and the Ironbloods were able to get the power to execute Operation Birdcage. Reen and even Red Rosvice tell her that it's lame that she doesn't think for herself and that she's too sensitive and fragile for this work, which is exactly what I've been thinking the entire time. And I really like this for Angelica's character because even though she's being manipulated against her own will, her personality and beliefs are still apparent until the end of the battle where her mask breaks off and she's herself again. This scene served more to save Angelica and Claire from themselves rather than Towa and the Queen, who are being held captive here. Which leads to my biggest issue with Act 2. Why are we going out of our way to save all these people who are perfectly fine and being treated properly in captivity when we're at the verge of a continental war? It doesn't make any sense, especially when all the people that are holding them captive are willing to let them join the party if we simply just fight them and ask nicely. Towa and the Queen are in custody of people that we trust and we know they won't hurt them. The party should be more focused on trying to save the world instead of their class members at this point in the story. The justification for these scenes from an in-world standpoint boils down to the opposing forces being forced to test the party so they won't get in trouble with their organizations, but from a narrative standpoint, this act primarily serves as development to tie up loose ends between our former allies and party members. After we save Angelica and Towa, the party heads over to Drekner Forest where they need to face off against Nightheart and General Craig to save Alphen and Tita. When we step foot into the fortress, Nightheart tells the party that the two of them are being treated with utmost care and that they're under the protection as guests and not prisoners. But if they want to free them, they'll have to come in and fight them. This made it even more apparent at how unnecessary this was for them to do since they're not in any apparent danger right now. There's no reason for them to try to go and save them right now. And it also doesn't help that once we reach the end, Reen just thanks them for keeping them safe. Just let them stay safe and go save the world. Doesn't make any sense to go save them. That being said, the scenes of development in this section were great, all things considered. On the way to fight Craig and Nightheart, we encounter Alan, who's been taken by the curse and is solely dedicated to fighting for the Empire and Bridget at any cost. I've always been heavily invested in the Bridget and Alan storyline since CS1, so this development had me tuned in. The next test involves us fighting our way through the branch campus students Mary and Markov and Leaves to save Tio and Elise. I have no idea why these people are actively trying to test our determination to save the world like we didn't just fight a civil war with them earlier, or why or how they even have Tio and Elise in custody. This involves us going through Leaves and level X of Einhell Keep, which is probably the most complicated and tedious dungeon in the entire franchise. Just thinking about it now gives me a headache, because I already dread going through the old schoolhouse equivalents in these games, so adding puzzles to the mix just made me dread it even more. Honestly, no crazy developments really happened between this section, and Tio and Elise joined the party. Between this and the next major story development, there's a really funny scene that I want to point out. Crow and Machias are sitting together talking about coffee, and Crow tells Machias to stop talking like he has a stick up his ass when he talks to him, and that he feels like Machias is the only person who treats him like an outsider to the group. Machias admits that he's been subconsciously doing this and he's never had a chance to actually talk with Crow in the past few years, and they agree to be more familiar with each other. I thought this scene was great because, as I've been saying since CS1, I feel like there's a ton of old Class 7 members that we never really see talking together, so I'm glad the writers pointed this out directly here. Stuff like this also happens in real life too. Like, I know y'all have that one person where you feel like you're around them all the time, but you don't really ever get to talk about it, and you guys just kind of subconsciously agree to not really talk about it or address each other. It's kind of weird. There's also the added detail of their S-Link finisher dialogue changing after the scene, which I really appreciate. Eventually, we're invited aboard the Pentegral where the entirety of Class 7's party finally gets to formally meet the reunited SSS and the Liberal Party. This is the scene that I've been waiting to see since I started playing these games. Even before I started playing Trails in the Sky SC, I'd seen a thumbnail of this scene in particular recommended to me on YouTube, which really became a big motivating force to keep up with the character interactions throughout these games, so thank you for whoever spoiled this moment for me. This stretch of the game was chock full of so many character interactions that I'd been anticipating throughout the entire franchise. There are way too many character interactions for me to talk about, so I'll just cover my favorites as usual. I loved the scene between Yuna and the SSS. The beginning of her character development revolved around her looking up to the SSS as an outsider looking in, so when they reunite and she says that she's happy to see them, Kia and the SSS say that she's just as much of an SSS member as all of them after everything she's done since CS3. Both the handshake scenes between Lloyd, Estelle, and Reen were amazing. Lloyd's speech reassuring the guilt that Reen feels for starting the war exemplified both their characters and backgrounds perfectly while also resolving the conflict in CS2. And finally, meeting the Calvard and Remferia leaders was interesting, especially since we know the next saga of games takes place in Calvard. This loosely reminded me of Osborne being introduced in Trails the Third. At this point, we're giving control to Reen to talk to everyone, and I do mean everyone aboard the Pentegral. Now, in my CS3 video, I complained about having to talk to everyone in the Valflame Palace, and I felt like that part of the game was really tedious and could have had more optional sequences. This scenario is exactly the same, but I didn't feel that at all this time around. And I think the biggest reason why I didn't feel this way this time around is because I actually care about most of the characters in this section. Most of the characters present in the Valflame Palace were old Class 7, and I don't really care for their interpersonal relationships in that game, but in this game, this is literally everyone in the series having interpersonal relationships that we've been waiting on, so I was having a blast talking to everyone in this scene. After Reen talks to everyone on the ship, everyone comes together to discuss the Meal Mirage plan, with Cassius leading as the supreme commander of the operation. The protagonists of each game respond to their duty in the operation by giving speeches as representatives of each of their respective countries. I love the execution of this scene, as we the player know what's at stake for everyone involved and what's led them to come together in this one scene. And this is all interrupted as every single villain possible comes to interrupt the meeting by hacking into the PowerPoint presentation, sending 8 battleships and the Glorious to the Pentegral. The party separates into 4 teams consisting of the men and women of each of the 3 ARC's parties, which leads into 2 parties fighting against Gareth and Gilbert, which was hilarious. I never get tired of seeing Gilbert, and it was funny especially this time since Estelle was leading the party. After defeating them, the parties fight the final boss of the act in Lecter, Leonidas, Zeno, Ines, Enea, Kruger, Mariabel, Shirley, Campanella, Cedric, Rutger, and Copper George. This series of fights serves to reignite the relationships that each of the party members have with their respective villains. There's a lot going on here, so I'll just make a summary of my biggest takeaways. The majority of Ellie's character since Azure has been her asking, what's going on with Belle, which is a crazy thing to ask here since Belle has been evil for almost 2 years now. Her character really hasn't progressed at all, even within the Crossbow games. We also learned that Campanella is non-binary, but we've been knowing this. The second model Aeons get summoned here as a backup, and all the Divine Night Wielders boot up and threaten to start the rivalries but don't. Why they didn't do it here to make it easier for everyone, I have no idea. Muse, Aurelia, and Bardius try to sacrifice themselves on the ship to save everyone, which I thought was kind of unnecessary since we literally have every single main party member in the series with us right now, and we should be able to handle our own. But I understand that they're all going against the Aeons too, so I guess I can give it a pass. But if you played Cold Steel, you know that they can't let this happen, and this scene is interrupted by the Courageous 2 appearing with Toval, Michael, Mueller, Shara, and Olivier in tow to save the day. Now, those of y'all that watched my CS3 video know that I didn't believe that everyone of the Courageous 2 died, so this reveal didn't surprise me in the slightest, but you best believe I was happy to see them again. The main aspect that I enjoyed about the Olivier reveal was how Cedric reacted to it. Cedric was relieved that his brother was still alive, but needed to follow his conviction and dedication to his orders from Osborne. And I love that Cedric is so firmly on the wrong side of the team because he has a multitude of complexes. His inferiority complexes hit hard here since he has our parties cornered only for his older brother to come back to life and save the day yet again. And I don't think that Cedric has succeeded once in this series. Like, the dude's just a walking string of L's at this point, to the point that I found myself rooting for him. Following this scene, Osborne, the Ironbloods, and a cursed Victor show up on global FaceTime to info dump. They declared that D-Day of the war, or Operation Jumanji, starts on September 1st, 6 days from now, and they allow everyone to leave, as usual, ending Act 2. Overall, the pacing of Act 2 was all over the place. They had to resolve so many storylines, character relationships, progress the plot of the Cold Steel arc on its own, as well as end the entire saga at the same time, which once again is a huge burden that had to fall on Cold Steel 4 as a game, and this act definitely took the brunt force of it. Once we return to the Courageous 2, we're caught up on how Olivier and them survived the explosion at the end of Cold Steel 3. And basically what happened was LeBlanc saved them by teleporting them out. This and everything else he did in the game honestly redeemed him from all those annoying riddles throughout the yeah, I'd say it did. He's a good guy. The party lines out their next plan of action before the rivalries, and it's decided the next best course of action is to travel around Erebonia and Crossbell to help people and gather allies, which makes no sense at this point of the story because we should already have a multitude of allies after gathering literal heroes of each of the arcs, going through a civil war, and being at the inception of a national war. Who else could we possibly need at this point that we don't already have? And why is helping citizens gonna help our cause when we're supposed to be the only saviors of the world? That being said, the loose ends in terms of character development and plot points throughout this section of the game were great, and I'll get to them soon. We eventually head up to the Luna Sanctuary where we have to undergo another gatekeeping trial to prove that we're worthy of power, and we end up fighting Vita, Aurelia, and Roselia, who reveals her true form. By the way, the model for this form is so good, and whoever designed this and modeled it needs a raise expeditiously. Once we defeat Roselia, we're shown the full story of the Black Records where it's revealed how each of the villains have been affected by the curse. Franz ended up designing the Panzer Soldats under the effect of the curse and became Black Alberic in order to further the operation after being possessed, which mainly included manipulating Zephyr. Osborne is the host of King Drekkel's soul and willingly gives control to Ishmelga and becomes an Awakener form in order to save Reen's life after losing his wife. George is revealed to be a pawn of the Black Workshop that was ordered to attend Thor's and live a normal life to report back to the workshop. He decided to betray the Black Workshop multiple times by reviving Crow in the rivalries, refusing to kill Angelica, and saving the Courageous on his own free will. Leanne was revived and watched over Drakel and his host Osborne for multiple generations out of her love for Drakels. I thought this one personally was the most believable and best reasoning for her being a villain, and this is how you write a sympathetic villain. Leanne's reasoning for becoming a villain of the game as a result of this scene was extremely believable and grounded, while also retroactively explaining and developing her character throughout the series. Once I saw this scene, I thought, oh, that's why she's always acted this way, which is what writers should always strive for when writing a sympathetic villain. Osborne's revelation also had a similar effect on me. The writers did a great job of keeping the two of them in a gray area in terms of personality and action. Even though they committed literal war crimes, I still felt empathy for the two of them because of the way that they were written to interact with the party and the respective organizations. I can't really say the same for Franz and George after their revelations though, but I'll get to that later. Our first rivalry target ends up being Rutger, but first we have to take a detour on the ship, the Gargantua, in order to bring the barrier down from around it first. In the middle of this dungeon, we end up having to fight Emily and Teresa, who are students at Thor's in Cold Steel 1 and 2. As I've said before, I love the idea of developing some of the former students into enemies, and the execution on the other hand could have been a lot better for these. The problem with the execution of this is that most of the former allies turned enemies can never come close to matching the strength of the parties, so they pretty much all pose no threat and are forced to basically take an L and throw the fight. All these scenes end up just being a friendly reunion with no tension. Once we reach the end of the dungeon, we encounter and fight Copper George, Irina, Schmidt, and Sharon, where they all reveal that they're only doing this because they want to test their technology, which is definitely a reason. I really don't like that the entirety of Elisa's family's motive ultimately boils down to them putting R&D and field testing over everything. I feel like this is a very shallow reasoning for them to do anything, and I didn't feel sympathetic towards any of them at all, and I really despise all of them. They have no redeemable qualities whatsoever as a family. And I'm pretty sure that was the point, but I don't think it was effective at developing much of anything. It made this entire scene feel like a waste of time by the end, and I didn't really care about anyone present in the scene. After we initially fight them, Angelica convinces George that he wasn't a pawn and that his memories with them at Thor's were genuine, and Irina decides that Black Alberic isn't her husband and tells Sharon she can renew her contract with her as a maid, but only if she wanted to. Black Albert decides to summon an Ion to fight, which goes berserk and tries to target Arena and Schmidt. George and Sharon stop it from attacking, which breaks the barrier generator that we came to stop initially. Once they let the villain walk out of the scene and everyone left over makes up, the camera pans over to George standing alone, where he just pulls out a gun and tries to shoot himself, which just made me laugh out loud because this scene was goofy as hell. Like, why did he do that? I was so taken aback and amused at this that I just paused and I couldn't even follow the scene after that. It was hilarious. I felt no sympathy for George already, but this scene kind of solidified it for me. George was a character that played his role of a pawn so well that I never developed any sort of opinion on him. He was just there. He's just George. And once he became a villain, I had no choice but to dislike him because he was such a non-character to me. And when they tried to make him sympathetic in this game, I had no reason to feel pity on him because I had no positive or negative feelings towards him at all, outside of him being Copper George. I just didn't care about him at all. After we finish this section, we make our way to the Draco Sanctuary where we encounter Zephyr. There's not much that can be said that hasn't already been said about how I feel about Xenos and Leonidas and their relationship, but we do get to learn about Leonidas' past, which is cool. Once we defeat Rutger, he actually dies a second time, leaving him with a heartfelt goodbye to Fee, where they both acknowledge that they always saw each other as father and daughter. This was a nice scene overall, but I didn't really feel too strongly about it otherwise. The next day, we board the Courageous again and go on side quests and bonding events for more of the NPC students of Thor's. There's a hidden side quest where we go to fight Gilbert in Aaron Village, which was absolutely hilarious. As I said before, none of the Gilbert sections missed their mark for me at all in this game. There's also a resolution from Kai and Tilia that serves as the resolution to Kai and Tilia's storyline as well as Hugo's storyline. And seeing the Sky Party join in on this resolution was a big surprise, and I enjoyed the developments and festivities that happened here. By the end of the day, each of the ARC's parties meet up in Crossbow to put on an ARC NCL performance to distract the military while the main party infiltrates Orcus Tower to turn off another barrier for the rivalries. All the interactions of the scene were a lot of fun to watch, and the performance itself was really cute too, and I'm always happy to see my boy Elliot get to do his thing. Once we reach the top of Orcus Tower, we encounter McBurn and Arcette, who's been turned into a puppet. This fight honestly just ends with us being saved by the entire Vander family as a whole, which was definitely cool and one of my favorite moments in this part of the game. Like, that was hype. That was really cool. We also get foreshadowing here that McBurn isn't from this world, which I'll get into in the finale of the story. When we reach the rooftop, Mariabelle is waiting for us, and instead of making us fight her, she shuts off the barrier for us and disappears, which just saves us a lot of trouble. The next day, we arrive at Stella Sanctuary, where we encounter and fight the Stallritter with Duvali. We learn that Aenea was offered as a test subject for the DG cult and that Aeneas was a bracer prior to joining the Stallritter. And I like that these characters are getting developed here, even though this might be the last time we see them. Once we reach the end of the dungeon, Arianrod is waiting for us to start the rivalries. Arianrod confirms that she's been searching and protecting Draco's soul in the form of Osborne in order to honor him. She joined Ouroboros in order to destroy Ismelga for herself, even if that meant she'd have to be a villain. Roselia is frustrated that she and Dracos didn't come to her for help, to which Arianrod speaks for Dracos, saying that he'd always say that humans need not rely on wishes for their own mistakes. I absolutely love this explanation because it shows how much Arianrod believed in Dracos' resolve while also building up Dracos as a character himself. Building up characters through the eyes and perception of other characters that the player has come to respect is something that's always effective in my eyes. A good example of this with another character we haven't met in this series is Yun Kafai. As of now, we haven't actually met him, but multiple characters throughout the series speak of him as a legendary swordsman. This includes all the users of the 8 Leaves 1 Blade sword style, such as Cassius, Arios, Richard, and Reen, and we know how strong these characters are, so what they say about him being a strong swordsman we can believe, just because of how strong we know they are. McBurn also does this when he compares someone's strength to Layaway, a character we fought against in the past. Going back to the story, we end up fighting her and her Divine Knight, and by the end of the scene, she's backstabbed and killed by Rufus, who leaves the scene as fast as he portaled in, leaving the party in the Stallritter to watch her die, for real this time. Once we leave the Stella Shrine, it's revealed that Valimar and Millian were given Arianrod's life force, which allows them to speak and manifest themselves again. During this reunion, the remainder of the core of Ouroboros and their ex-members, minus McBurn, show up to pay their respects to Arianrod. Campanella leaves right after snapping to summon multiple salt pails in the final dungeon of the game all across Erebonia, and I personally love that you can see this no matter where you are in Erebonia. It adds to the much needed sense of dread and increases the level of tension of the looming continental war. Just kidding! We need to do a pre-Final Dungeon Festivities Beach Resort episode! Now, I always make a point about how the pre-Final Dungeon sections of these games kill the pacing, but come on. I always eat these sections up, and I was especially looking forward to this one because the Eventide chapter includes all the final bonding events and has all the characters throughout the saga in one place coming together to interact with each other. I've been looking forward to this chapter since I started the game, and it most definitely delivered. Again, I won't go through every interaction, but I'll go through a few that I really enjoyed. The scene between Milliam and Eustace are easily some of my favorite interactions in the entire series. I've always loved their interactions, so this scene made me very happy. Watching Mint progress Makarov and Mary's relationship once again was really cute. Rean and Valamar's conversation about Dracos was really cool, and I like how sentient he's become by this point in the story. Lind and Gaius talking alone was cute, but what really threw me off was Gaius calling the jetty by its name. I had no idea that the pier they're standing on is called a jetty, so I thought he was speaking in some kind of slang to impress Lind, which absolutely killed me, and I still interpret it that way. We find that Anton is here amongst all the party members he's ever met throughout the series, and he later makes up with Sharon, which was honestly one of the best romantic developments I've seen in the series. I'm so happy our boys finally won after all these years. Olivier and Shara, and eventually Olivier and Mueller, drink together, which eventually leads to Olivier proposing to Shara by the end of the night, which is one of the other best romantic developments in the series. By the end of the night, Cassius calls Rean over and teaches him the final form of the 8 leaves 1 blade form, Void. I love this scene because it's a symbolic passing of the torch to not only Rean as the student, but the players themselves. Cassius was one of the first characters we meet in the series in Trails in the Sky, and now he's teaching Rean, the last character of the saga, his technique. I thought this was well executed from a narrative standpoint, and that realization made me smile. Later, we're threatened by Claire, who tries to isolate and restrain Rean, who willingly goes into the march alone, which, again, is a flaw in his character that he still hasn't learned, to meet up with her. When she tries to detain him, he drops his weapon and calls her bluff, and Millian comes out to try to convince Claire that it wasn't her fault that she died. Claire decides to give up on fighting Rean until the final battle, and because of this, leaves. I don't really have an opinion on this scene. This wraps up Act 3 and begins the finale of the game. Overall, Act 3 was more or less the same as Act 2. It served as a vehicle to develop the last few old Class 7 members and the NPC class members while also starting the rivalries. The execution was a lot tighter compared to Act 2, and most of the encounters throughout this arc were necessary, but I still didn't feel attached to most of what was being developed and paid off in this act on a macro level. That being said, it's time for the finale. This is it, the finale of the game, and the finale of the first saga in the series. The start of the final day marks the D-Day of war. The day begins and the war starts 11 hours from the opening scene. That means we've got to get going now. There's not a second to lose. But before the war officially starts in 11 hours, we need to destroy the 5 salt pails, talk to the citizens of Erebonia, fulfill some requests which involve helping Stark play Crow and Vantage Masters, lay the ghost of Hamel to rest, help Sandy host and decorate an Ulster Harvest Festival, interview people in Crossbell City, explore the Geofront, help destroy some wanted monsters in Einhell Keep, gather Zemurian ore, play Teal and Pom Pom Party, help Bridget save her and Alan's relationship from the Cursed, explore Stargazer's Tower, and finally, help Toval explore a new shrine that appeared. As soon as I saw that I had to do all this, the tension that they just built up in the last chapter for the finale completely dropped for me. It's hard to believe that they were able, let alone willing, to do all this literally 11 hours before the start of a war. That being said, again, even though I'm being critical, I loved all of these side quests. The Hamel quest in particular was something that I've been waiting to do since the Sky arc and the introduction of Ash. I love that by the end of the side quest, Ash comes out of it by affirming that his past ties to Hamel and his history don't define him and have nothing to do with who he is now. He will always be Ash Carbide before anything else, and he also helps Joshua come to terms with this himself. By the end, the soul of Leyway speaks to the entirety of the party, which definitely got to me. We also get to see Ren get to speak directly to Harold, her father, before he's deployed for the war. The way that she always directly makes herself present now in order to get her parents second guessing themselves always had me on the edge of my seat, especially since we know how much of an active character she has and will be throughout the series. In terms of the Ulster Harvest Festival, I thought it was a great side quest with great development, but Sandy couldn't have chose a worse time to try to have a festival right now. Like, we're literally 11 hours away from a war. Bridget and Alan's quest was also a great resolution of their storyline, which was one of the ones that I was looking forward to the most throughout the Cold Steel arc. I love that Patrick was the one to stand at the forefront and be the one to convince and fight him in the end, and that the entirety of Old Class 7 was there for him. Toval's side quest is the key to unlocking the true ending and requires the player to finish every side quest in the game. Once we discover the hidden shrine, we encounter Argrest, the true form of the final boss of Trails of Cold Steel 3, and by extension, the reason the curse was spread. Argrest gives Rean its power upon defeating it, which becomes a surprise tool that'll help us later. Once we finish all the side quests before the final battle, a scene takes place that shows all the troops across Erebonia are fighting and navigating the war in real time. And I absolutely love that they took the time to show us a detailed evidence that this war is going down while the main party was fighting. As I said before, I never felt like there was a war going on behind the scenes in CS2, so the writers taking the 10 minutes to detail all this out made me really happy. Once we focus back on the main cast, we find that the party's been divided into 5 to take down the 5 salt pails. This was pretty much done so that we can use all the party members throughout the series and not have 30 characters jumping one character at a time. So by extension, this made the section feel like busy work. None of these characters get developed through these sections, and I just ran through all the enemies to get through each section. Once we take down all 5 salt pails, we end up getting to the final dungeon. We meet our first gatekeepers of the dungeon, Lecter and Claire. Their attitude before the fight shows that they've already accepted that they'll fail their mission without a doubt. And I found it hilarious because Reen's like, yeah, we won't even need all 18 of us to beat the 2 of you. Like, I hope not. Once we finish jumping them, their mission is officially deemed a failure and they both try to off themselves. And I thought this didn't really make sense and was irrational, but it really does make sense because this mission was literally their entire life's work. I think I felt I couldn't take that decision of the scene seriously because of how the series has treated similar scenes in the past, especially after that goofy ass scene with George. After Class 7 saves Lecter and Claire, they enter the fortress and rest in the garden area where we can talk with all of Class 7. I love this part of the game because it serves the same purpose as the Hermit's Garden and Trails the Third. The writers get to give characters their last few interactions of the game and reinforce their mindsets going to the final battles to the player. This type of optional dialogue is what made me love Trails the Third, so I'm glad we got to see a bit of it here. The next gatekeepers of the dungeon are Cedric and Shirley. And at this point, Cedric has completely lost it and is fully committed to his role in the final battle. I like how he tries to snap at Altina for not being a real person, and everyone in New Class 7 pops back and roasts the hell out of him. They also break down his character, and it's further revealed that he's pretty much just been groomed by Osborne into being a pawn. He snaps out of it and admits that he's been controlled by his multitude of inferiority complexes, which is where Shirley steps in and starts telling him to step up too. I love that they've paired up Shirley and Cedric and gave him a kind of brother-sister dynamic after this scene. Shirley's a character that's so confident in who she is and what she does, while Cedric is the complete opposite, so they're perfect foils for each other, and I didn't really see it until this scene. And speaking of foils, Kurt also tries to sympathize with Cedric after his defeat by telling him that he also has an inferiority complex. The only difference is that he's been able to overcome it and that he needs Cedric to do so as well, so they can be on even footing as rivals and friends. The development surrounding Cedric's character is probably one of my favorites in Cold Steel Arc, which is surprising because I did not like this character at first. It's definitely crept up on me, and I'm glad they've left it open for the future of the series. The next gatekeepers are Mariabel and Campanella, and this scene reveals a lot towards the overarching plot of the story. Campanella reveals that the Grandmaster only wants to witness the reformation of the Great One, regardless of whether or not it's completely reformed. They just want to see how humanity interacts and uses the Septarians. This also reveals the fact that Ouroboros is actually a part of something bigger than the plans we've been presented the past 3 arcs of the games as well. Yuna and New Class 7 piece together a bit of the truth that Ouroboros was presenting here, to which Mariabel confirms. She states that anyone who cared enough to put these pieces together should have been able to realize what was truly going on the whole time. I also like that Campanella and Mariabel reference Yuna's role as a protagonist. Gaius has an amazing line that reflects that perfectly. He says if Reen is the core of Class 7, then maybe Yuna is the bridge that links Class 7 to the world. This is exactly how I feel about Yuna's character as a party member and a protagonist in relation to Reen. Prior to Cold Steel 3, Reen has represented Erebonia as a whole, but it wasn't until Yuna joined Class 7 that he began to expand his worldview to crossbow and also liberal. As soon as I saw this, I started clapping, like Gaius never misses. The next gatekeepers are Rufus and Black Alberich. Something I thought was interesting was that Alberich retroactively revealed that the Nosferatu enemies in the final area of Cold Steel 1 were the previous Awakeners of the Divine Knights and their graves respectively. The recontextualization of elements of the earlier games in the series is something that I really liked about Cold Steel 3 and 4. I loved Reen's speech here, especially when he says, "We create meaning in our lives by our interactions with others, and it's the bonds between people that shape the world." This specific line stood out and stuck with me, especially considering Reen's character throughout the series. After we win the fight, Eustace confronts Rufus, stating that he lost because he refused to rely on anyone but himself, and he also punches the shit out of him, which made me jump out of my seat. I was not expecting that. I think this interaction was one of my favorites in the final dungeon. And best for last, the final gatekeeper is McBurn. We find out here that McBurn might be from a completely other world besides Zemuria, which completely blew me away. I've been waiting for more world building like this, so I was on the edge of my seat while watching this scene, and I've also been told that this might make Nayuta a canon game in the Trails universe, which is cool. I have not played that one yet. I might do it when it actually officially releases. It makes sense that McBurn is from a different world though, because he has a very distinct and unique style compared to every other character in the series. This entire section, along with Campanella's dialogue, expands our understanding of the world of Zemuria, and even beyond that on the scale of the ending of Trails in the Sky SC and Trails the Third, which really had me thinking since I finished the game, but again, we'll get to that later. Also, during this fight, McBurn was like, I don't know what was going on, but he blue screened my computer. I think it just overheated from too much peak or something, but too many flames. I don't know what happened. Winning the fight against McBurn in his true form allows him to remember the truth of something, which leads him to apologize to the party and leaves him with a new purpose and objective. This is one of the only times that I've enjoyed the writers letting the villain get away without being defeated, because it's completely in character and it actually progresses the overall narrative and world building of the series. 5 gatekeepers in a final dungeon later, we finally reach the final encounter, Big Daddy Osborne himself. One of the first things that he does in this scene is force Valimar to come out and give him the sword. And I like that the two of them still talk to each other as if they're old friends or at the very least comrades. The tone of this scene doesn't feel like a final battle in a good way. It was really unsettling and exciting to see how calm everyone was here, knowing that this could elevate into the final battle at any point. Rean accepts that Osborne did what he had to in becoming the world's enemy, and also acknowledges him as his father for the first time. Osborne states that seeing Class 7 before him made him realize that his fears that the curse would ruin the future were unfounded, which I really like from a thematic standpoint. This is followed by the final battle with Osborne and the final stage of the rivalries. The bittersweet final scene with Rean, Millium, and Osborne takes place in a void that reminded me of the final battle of Final Fantasy VII. Rean appears outside the fortress carrying the lifeless Ebon Knight, and we find out that Ishmelga has completely overtaken Rean and Valimar after winning the rivalries. Also, he looks like Sakura from Heaven's Feel. Because of this, he has no choice but to divert it away from everyone else as he, Millium, and Crow fly away from the sky and just explode. We see a montage of everyone, villains and allies alike, watching the scene as the song I No Uta plays in the background. Now, y'all know when JRPGs pull out the vocal theme, some shit's going down. My jaw dropped when I saw this scene, and I thought it did a great job of expanding Rean's fatal character flaw of being too self-sacrificial and being the literal sacrifice. I also like the idea of having a bad ending, especially considering the thematic focus of this entire arc. I also didn't jump immediately into the true ending. I actually waited a day to play the true ending, so this scene definitely stayed in my mind for a little bit. But let's run that back to the true ending. Franz is able to come back and ask for forgiveness from Elisa and tell Rean that his father Osborne had to sacrifice himself and become the villain out of necessity, and that Rean can finish what he started. Valimar tells Rean that he needs to cleanse his soul by utilizing the power of friendship, which made me laugh, but I mean, it makes sense in context of the story. Everyone channels into the spirit bomb, and Rean looks within himself to find Leanne, Rutger, and Osborne. They tell him that they've been watching him from the beginning and that he's the hope of Erebonia. Rean uses the final form of the 8 Leaves 1 Blade form to vanquish Ishmelga and is able to return without sacrificing himself like in the original ending. This is followed by Ishmelga materializing itself into the world plane, which is followed by a multi-phase final battle that lets you use every single party member in the Erebonia arc divided into 3 teams. This really reminded me of the Kefka fight in Final Fantasy VI, and I absolutely love switching between all party members and playing every single one for the last time. Until Hajimari. Once we defeat Ishmelga, Millium and Rean confront it head on, and the two of them conclude that Ishmelga was humanity's creation, which was interesting to me from a lore standpoint now that I've stepped back and rewatched all of these scenes as a whole. Since Ouroboros and the Grandmaster refer to their work as an observation, the entirety of what's happening in this entire saga could be seen as a simulation. It's even more apparent when Millium refers to the Ebon Knight as a logic system as if it were some kind of computer virus, and Ishmelga also refers to itself as a god. As a fan of Xenogears and the Xeno series, I love the concept of this, even if I'm way off the mark. Like, just thinking about this in relation to everything that I've just said is kind of crazy. Rean and Osborne have one final interaction after Ishmelga is properly defeated. Rean acknowledges that he and Osborne both share the same self-sacrificial nature, and Osborne tells Rean to rely on his friends more. They say their goodbyes as father and son, and Rean returns to his friends. I thought that Osborne taking on the burden of being the villain of Erebonia and passing that trauma and burden onto his son was incredible. The overarching theme of parents or people passing on their will and by extension trauma to their children throughout the story was interesting, and I think that I want to talk about it more in detail, but I also don't have time anymore, so I might just write it, or somebody else in the comments can talk about that more. By the way, if the theme of inherited will is interesting to you, read One Piece. Read One Piece. Just read One Piece. It don't matter. When Rean returns, he finds that his hair has gone back to its normal color too, and I thought it was funny that Crow said he was tired of Rean stealing his look right before he started to disappear. Crow and Millium both started to fade away after the final encounter, which I didn't believe at all until Rean handed Eustace Millium's sword, and at that point I was like, no way, they're not actually doing this, are they? Valimar and Ordeon hop in on the train too, as he calls all his siblings quote unquote to return as one. At this point, I definitely started to believe that they were all going to die for good, but, you know, they can't let that happen. Nobody dies in this series. Franz also gets his final and technically first interaction with Elisa here. He orders the Divine Knights to give Millium and Crow back their life force, and Valimar and Reen get to have their parting interaction, which may be the most emotional out of everything in this ending. Like, those are the bros right there. Valimar is really the only constant throughout this arc, and seeing him die really tied the story together. Reen didn't and doesn't need Valimar to bail him out of danger anymore, since he's strong enough to stand on his own with his friends now. And I mean, he's always been strong enough without Valimar, but that's beside the point. Hearing him say that Reen is his true friend and saying that he's proud of the man he's become today made my heart stop a little bit. It's Iron Giant all over again. Lecter and Claire watch this scene from the background and tell each other that they need to take responsibility for their actions in this. Rufus steps in to tell them that they'll be needing to rebuild and maintain order for the Empire, which was interesting. More importantly, Cedric and Shirley also overlook the scene where Cedric decides that he needs to disappear from the Empire entirely and decides to join Ouroboros as an enforcer. This development caught me completely off guard and made me excited for his role in the future of the series. To conclude the game, there's a montage that explains what happens after the final scene of the game, similar to the ending of Trails to Azure. We'll most likely end up seeing most of these events play out at the beginning of Hajimari? By far the biggest reveal here is that Cedric joined Ouroboros, but it's not clarified whether or not he was made an enforcer. After this scene, we find Class 7 standing in a lab that holds the new body for Millium that was built by Franz. Millium is resurrected and the credits roll. This whole credit sequence made me a little bit emotional, I'm not gonna lie. We get to see every single playable character throughout the series hanging out at Olivier and Cher's wedding. It really put into perspective how all these characters' paths have become intertwined by the end of the saga. This is also the first time we get to see Kevin and Reese together since Trails the Third, which is kind of crazy, but hey, they had to throw it in there somewhere. Actually, wait, nah, they were in the anime. I just realized that they were in the anime too. That final panel of Reen standing alone and then being stormed by all his friends at the end, that made me tear up. That was probably the first time we've seen him genuinely smile since he was at Thor's. But enough of that, there's something that happens after this credit scene that I absolutely need to talk about. Once you go through the true ending on a second playthrough or just go on YouTube like I did, another scene plays, and here we see Campanella in the Celestial Globe from Trails the Third, which is where we first witnessed the Grandmaster. The only difference is that this time, when we get further into the scene, the first Anguis asks her to reveal herself, and after a few seconds, the camera pans to one of the pillars and we finally get to see not the Grandmaster for the first time, or at least the bottom half of her face. The first time I watched this scene, I was surprised because I've already seen her multiple times on the box art for Hajimari, and it's really been under my nose for years at this point. As for my theory on her identity, my theory is that this character is, or at least is related to, Celeste from, you guessed it, once again, Trails the Third. Celeste refers to herself as a shadow bound by the laws of Phantasma. This is the exact same way that the Grandmaster refers to herself as a shadow that exists solely to announce the appointed time to the world. What's also interesting is that she states that 3 years yet remain until all returns to primordial nothingness. This scene does a great job of setting up for the future of the series, and I'm excited to see how it ties into Hajimari in the next saga of the series. And with that, Trails of Cold Steel 4 is completed and the first saga of the series is done. Hey, what's up y'all? Thanks for watching the video. You already know I appreciate it, especially if you've stuck through with all 4 of these Cold Steel videos. Like, it's been a real process. I think it's been about 2 years since I started playing the Trails games, and it's probably been like a year and a half since I started making these longer form videos. I haven't really talked about it publicly on my YouTube, but my whole life has changed for the better. Like, I have a kind of career path going on right now, so I don't have time to be playing 100+ hour JRPGs and making hour-and-a-half long videos on them anymore. But I wanted to see the Cold Steel series through. So with Reverie, I'm definitely going to make a video on it. It's just not going to be an hour-and-a-half long. It's probably going to be more focused on like the thematics and stuff like that. And I also might try to venture away from JRPG content and try to do more music stuff, because that's really where my heart's at. So if you like that, look forward to that in the future. And, you know, as usual, gotta say it again, thank you for watching these videos. It means a lot to me. It really changed who I am as a person. Not gonna get too much into that, but just know I appreciate you. Like, comment, subscribe. Look out for the next video. You know where to find me. I'll catch y'all next time.